classes. So as you can see through these like charts, during the first half of the 19th century, the economy of the United States grew 3 times faster than it had during the 18th century. You're also going to see because of this, the living standards for most Americans actually improved, though I should point out that wealth becomes a lot more concentrated. So we're seeing basically extremes of wealth and poverty, unlike before. That gap between the rich and the poor is widening. Giving you some numbers so you can kind of see this. In 1800, the richest 10% owned about 40 to 50% of the national wealth, whereas when you get to the 1850s, that richest 10% now owns about 70% of the national wealth. We're also going to see new classes come about during this time, such as a new middle class. This basically grew as the number of non-manual jobs increased. Very much if you're part of the middle class, it's because, I should say it's because it includes the idea of the separation of work and home. And so the workplace has become like this specialized location, and generally it's for production or selling what has been produced. So now you're seeing people like leave for work in the morning, whereas previously when it was an agrarian society, people's farms were their homes. You also can see a big part of being part of this new middle class is having like servants. This becomes a status symbol. Now, to be a servant was seen as degrading for most native-born white women, and so generally these positions are going to be filled by either African-American women or young immigrant, especially like Irish women. This new middle class, you might be going, well, it doesn't sound like they're really in the middle of society. Kind of keep in mind, because of the concentrated extremes of wealth, the average in the middle is further, it's higher up basically. And so we're going to see that they do things like turn to etiquette books for what is supposed to be proper manners in public. They really wanted to shape a lot of their behavior by the tenets of evangelical religion, partly because it's going to be linked to a lot of those revivals, religious revivals during like the 1820s and 1830s. They even tied this into work. For instance, economic and moral success is supposed to now depend on like virtues like sobriety and self-restraint and hard work. And therefore, in this way, religion is actually approving of men being more aggressive and more ambitious at the workplace, as long as like these businessmen reformed their moral lives and, you know, helped others to do the same, which is of course very reassuring to employers and like entrepreneurs. Also, I'm going to get into a reform later that's going to be temperance, but temperance, the prohibition of alcoholic beverages, is really going to be, this abstinence from alcohol is one of the biggest telling forms of evidence that most likely if you were participating in temperance, you were probably part of the middle class at this time. We're also going to see women are going to change a little bit in this time period with the middle class. Basically, you see their role is going to evolve because evangelical ministers in the North especially are going to enshrine women as the moral superiors of men. That women, while being, you know, weak and passive, are also supposed to be the ones that are more pure and pious. It's no surprise with this idea that women generally outnumbered men when it came to like evangelical services, prayer meetings, and other religious gatherings. They were the ones that were expected to, you know, make their home be a loving center of domesticity. And in that way, motherhood was, you know, the Christian nurturing of souls more than anything else. You're also going to see, partly because of this, families become smaller. The other reason for this is that children just don't have the same economic asset they did previously, at least for this middle class. And so you're seeing more and more limited size of families. And this means that couples are stopping having children at an earlier age. And there's actually being more care and financial resources being put into like child rearing. And so this brings into this whole idea of the cult of domesticity for women more than anything else. So this is that belief that women, by virtue of their sex, are their sphere in life of influence really should be the home. And they're the moral guardians of people's family lives. Whereas the men's sphere, of course, is the competitive world of business and politics. We also have our working class. Now, thinking back to like before exam 2 and everything like that, when we were looking at like pre-industrial United States, generally this was like native born, artisan origins and everything. But now, really the working class generally was urban workers, and a lot of times they are immigrants or children of immigrants who had never been an artisan in some sort of skilled craft. Industrialization is actually going to cause the unity of the old artisan class to splinter, because what happens is the ambitious like master craftsman might rise through the ranks and become like a small businessman or a manufacturer and own some sort of manufacturer enterprise. And so they're really joining in that middle class. Whereas like by the 1830s, if you were a journeyman, you had very little hope of like owning your own shop one day, because shops are disappearing in lieu of manufacturing enterprises. This is actually what ends up forming the earliest trade unions in the United States, especially in the 1820s and 1830s. Basically, these journeymen wanted, better wages, shorter hours, to enhance their job security. And this labor movement launched about 150 strikes in the mid-1830s. Now, when you get the Panic of 1837, this is really going to decimate union membership. When things are going bad, generally unions don't necessarily push for more, because there's an element of you're happy that you have a job, so to speak. There is 2 victories, though, that labor unions will gain during this time period. The 2 victories are going to be, firstly, employers are going to accept a 10-hour workday. Generally today, it's an 8 or 9-hour workday, although depending on what profession you go into, sometimes there's 12-hour workdays and everything like that, so just keep that in mind. And then there's actually a Supreme Court case, Commonwealth v. Hunt, that rules that a trade union is not necessarily subject to laws against criminal conspiracies, and that a strike could be used to force employers to hire only union members. This is a really big deal because it's basically legitimizing trade unions and allowing for strikes and not saying they're criminals. Now, they're definitely going to be looked down upon, especially as we get into more and more American history, but it still has legitimized them in this moment. Unions generally are going to defend like artisanal rights, and they generally ignored workers whose jobs never had like craft status. And so you even see this division of workers widening. So you see this also in other ways. For instance, like in the 1840s, a lot of American-born artisans would start joining in like nativist organizations that wanted to curb mass immigration from Europe and like limit political rights for Catholic immigrants. A lot of this comes from the fact that they were really concerned about job security, and that these immigrants coming in might take their jobs because they can split them up into semi-skilled tasks and pay them less overall. And so that's where a lot of this nativism comes from. While one might understand it, it's also really problematic because a lot of it then shows prejudice against specific ethnicities and everything. Now, that being said, as much as there's this division between native-born, lowercase n, and immigrants, it's a nearly universal demand that all white workers basically saw black workers should be confined to the most menial jobs. So there you go, racism very prevalent. And then there's also the gender divide as well. Very much there was this expectation that females should still be dependent on men. And so like men would start arguing in like the 1830s that, you know, their wages would be higher if females were barred from the labor force, because there's an element of women you didn't have to pay as much because women were not supposed to be the breadwinners of the family. And so they were just supplemental income at most. And so the idea was that, oh, well, if we barred women from working here, then they would have to pay the men better, because if you let a woman work that job, you could pay them less, and then that takes away the bargaining power of men. So you can see this reasoning. Not that, you know, there's clearly some issues with all of this anyway. But this meant that a lot of men workers would actually try to make women only be able to do the lowest paying and most exploited jobs. And women actually did try to organize against this, but the male-dominated labor movement basically refused to lend them much support, and instead would basically restrict their assistance to pushing for legislation for like limiting the number of hours women worked as well as like children worked. And the idea was that it was like protective legislation. We don't want to overwork our women, so we want to protect them, but this takes away women's bargaining power to make more, and thus a lot of times money is, you know, tied to equality. So thinking about everything that has been covered so far with the Industrial Revolution that is really occurring more so in the North, I want you to take a second and to compare the North to the South. What are their biggest differences?